So we're going to talk about absolutism, just like we talked about in France the other day. But now we're going to take it east to Russia, and we're going to look at two particular leaders with cool names: Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great. So one terrible, one great. All right, now, here's Ivan, and we're going to look at him because he's the first one to give himself this term czar, and we'll talk about what that means. In 1533, so early 16th century, he becomes the king of Russia. And just like Louis and these other monarchs, he struggles against the nobles who have their own power in their own land. And so he struggles for power with them, but he's going to solve it in a different way than Louis did. Remember, Louis built Versailles and made them all live with him and party with him so he could keep an eye on them. Ivan's going to have a much simpler, more Russian solution for this. And when he seizes power, he has himself called Tsar, which is the Russian word for Caesar. Okay, so like Augustus Caesar or Julius Caesar, he wants to be basically thought of as an emperor over this huge empire, which Russia will become under his rule. And like many Russian leaders, he rules by putting fear into his people. And so he settles the problem with the rebellious nobles by killing them and taking their lands. So simpler than building a palace and forcing them to live there. And this nickname we're going to talk about, the Terrible, okay? Now, it means or meant something different back then than it does now. Like, if you watched the game last night, the Jacksonville Jaguars were terrible, okay? But that's not what it meant back then. Terrible meant scary, so tough, so powerful that you're scared of them. And so Ivan kind of likes this nickname, and he's not going to do a lot to convince people otherwise. All right. One thing that does cement his reputation as being terrible, and you'll see this in the video, is down here you see he beats his son to death with his scepter, which is like a royal fancy cane that you get. And you'll learn more about that in the video. All right. So we're going to watch a real short video, and you got to ask yourself, is he truly terrible, or is he just an ambitious, powerful king? So I've got to mute me, which I hate doing, but there. Oh, there.
Ivan IV Vasilievich, or the Terrible if you prefer, though the fearsome may be more apt, was only 3 years old when he became the Grand Prince of Moscow. And like most 3-year-old princes, he was soundly ignored. But luckily, instead of being swept under the rug in favor of a more senior leader, his family and the nobles put in charge by his father were too busy crab-bucketing themselves to take the young prince out of the picture. Shortly after he came of age then, Ivan was given the title of Tsar, becoming the emperor of a third Rome, great enough to rival the Mongol Khans, appointed to enact God's will on earth, basically what the Holy Roman Emperors did in the West a long time ago, but it meant that Ivan was in charge once and for all. Honest to God, no clue how everyone else got on board with that one. Next on the agenda, Ivan gets hitched to a girl from the Romanov family, yes, those Romanovs, and things are actually pretty alright in Russia. Right off the bat, he started modernizing. He founded Russia's first publishing house, twice. The first time, a bunch of scribes came and burnt down the building before it could take their gerbs, so he refounded it and started printing religious texts because he was also a devout Christian. He made a 3-estate-style parliament with nobles, clergy, and commoners. Bit of a rubber stamp, but gotta start somewhere. He cracked down on judicial corruption, gave legal and financial power to smaller communities. Nothing crazy, just reasonable, proactive governance. Bazinga. And, big game changer, he made a standing army that would train during peacetime, which for reference England didn't have until Cromwell more than 100 years later. And boy howdy did Ivan put that army to use. In fact, there wasn't that much peacetime for them to train in because he was so busy getting that land, and doing it in a really clever way to boot. He had his army build a fortress that could be taken apart like some kind of IKEA castle, floated it down the Volga River, and rebuilt it in enemy territory lickety-split, which is how he conquered the Kazan Khanate and put an end to 100 years of conflict. And what does he do to celebrate? He commissions one of the most iconic pieces of Russian architecture in history. It was so lovely, in fact, that he blinded the architect so he could never make anything more beautiful. I'm kidding, he hired him to make several more buildings, the craziness comes later. But first, he takes over 2 more khanates and then turns his eyes to Livonia, this bit of the Baltic here, for those awesome trading ports that don't freeze over for half the year. Long story short, he was shaping up to be Peter the Great 150 years early and without the beard taxes. Except then he hits a wall. One of his best friends defects to Lithuania and his wife up and dies on him. All this being too much for Ivan, he musters up that big Tsar energy and quits. Straight up leaves Moscow. For months. No warning, no contact, nada. You'd think the nobles would love this, but they're freaking out because most people kinda hate them and they have no idea what to do. With nowhere else to turn, they show up at Ivan's doorstep begging, please come back.
No, you are mean and all you do is embezzle and treason.
Please?
No.
Pretty please? Come on, what's it gonna take?
I come back on one condition.
What's that?
Absolute power.
Well, he's been a pretty good ruler so far. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? And it is here that revolutionary revisionist Ivan IV evicts everyone, evincing inner evil. He claims huge swaths of land as his own private property.
But, sir, people live there already? Don't worry, I've come up with just the thing. Say hello to my private army.
He took mostly from the nobles, but uprooted a good number of peasants along the way. Plus, he gave his army their own land to do literally whatever they wanted with, at which point trickle-down oppression started to take over. But, technically speaking, he was just clearing out trespassers. It's not like he was sending his army into his own towns with the explicit intent of killing, torturing, and pillaging. About that. At this point in time, there's an epidemic and a famine. And did I mention the Livonian War is still ongoing after 12 years? But it's not all bad. The city of Novgorod is doing all right. Too all right. So all right, they might start getting ideas about defecting. Someone better put a stop to all that all rightness. Now they'll never want to leave. Then he abdicates again and puts this guy Simeon in charge, and oh no, Simeon is taking even more land for the Tsar, this time from the monasteries. That's not a nice thing to do. Ivan would never do this. Better put Ivan back in charge. You know what else Ivan would never do? Return all the land that Simeon took. After that, it was mostly a lot of treason and various forms of execution and torture. And, lest we forget, he also competed for the title of History's Worst Dad. Like any proud father, he saw his daughter-in-law dressed immodestly and ruthlessly beat her, potentially causing her miscarriage. Did I mention she was pregnant? Then his son stepped in and said, Dad, what the heck? And Ivan bashed his head in with his staff, which is where this awesome painting comes from. As a husband, he was second only to Henry VIII. There's even a little rhyme to help you remember. It goes, poisoned, 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 nunnery, nunnery survived. There's a reason Henry's wives are more well-known. So, he lost his oldest son and 5 wives, but it's not like things were all bad. I mean, he was also a musician. He wrote the background music you're listening to right now. How can you not love this guy? Anyway, the Livonian War finally comes to a close after 25 years. Then Ivan dies of natural causes, so I guess all that paranoia must have been worth it after all. But wait, there's more! Longtime viewer.
All right, so that story about him blinding the architect after he built St. Basil's, there's all kinds of stories like that about Ivan, and he doesn't really try to discourage them because he wants people to be afraid of him. But then he does die, and every time this happens in Russia, all the way up to present day, they don't have a good way for transferring power from one czar or one party secretary or one president to another, and so there's always some chaos. And there is when Ivan dies, and there is the time of troubles. Ultimately, though, they unite behind Michael Romanov. Now, Ivan had married, as you saw in the video, a Romanov. And when Michael becomes Tsar, the Romanovs take the throne of Russia, and they rule Russia continuously for 303 years. 304 years, until 1917, when they are toppled in the Russian Revolution, which we will get to early next semester, hopefully in person. And so Ivan did a lot of stuff. He expanded Russia. He centralized his power. So in a lot of ways, just a ruthless and effective king. But then he also has this reputation that he in part created for being terrible. Now let's look at the Great. There's Peter the Great. And notice he's not dressed like Ivan, okay? He doesn't have a big, long fur robe on. He's not wearing a fur hat. He's dressed like a European, right? These are Western European clothes. He doesn't have the big ZZ Top beard, just the mustache. Okay. He looks European because he wants Europe. I mean, he wants Russia to look European. So he becomes czar in 1696 after his brother dies mysteriously. They were co-czars for a while. So he becomes czar on his own in 1696, and he starts reforming Russia in the way only an absolute leader could. He's simply going to force change on his people. So why does he want to change? What's different about Russia from those European countries we've been looking at? Right? Well, it's still a land of serfs and lords, right? The lords are called boyars in Russia, but it's medieval. Okay, it's like 10th century Europe at the end of the 17th century. And so he wants to change that and make Russia more modern socially and economically. It's also very isolated from the rest of Europe. You have to go through a whole bunch of territory to get from Central Europe through Eastern Europe to Russia. And so most people are cut off from European culture, which Peter loves. He's going to live after the stuff we talk about next week, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, which has huge impact on Peter. And he wants his people, not all of them, but his elites, to be better educated. And so, they have little cultural or educational contact with Western Europe, and they are viewed by Western Europeans as backwards savages, and he wants to change that. And there are religious differences. Way back in the 11th century, all of Christianity split for the first time. And the Western Christians formed what we now call the Catholic Church, and the Eastern Christians formed a bunch of churches that we now call Orthodox. And each different nation or empire had its own Orthodox church. And so it's distinctly different from the West. If you see churches that have the onion-shaped domes like St. Basil's in the video, those are Orthodox churches. And there's one by Costco in San Marcos. I mean, they're all over the place. So there's still many Orthodox churches even here in San Diego. And so Peter decides there's no replacement for experience, so he heads west. And he is going to tour Western Europe. And he's going to do it in disguise. He doesn't go there officially as the czar, because if he visits one kingdom as the official king of the other kingdom, you have to have all kinds of fancy banquets and dinners and stuff Peter doesn't want to waste his time on. And so he goes in disguise. And also he has to go, I mean, everyone knows who he is. So he's treated well. They don't treat him badly. It's known he's the czar, but he doesn't want to be recognized. And he can't avoid being recognized because he's 6'6". And this is before being tall was really a thing. Most men are 5'8", 5'9", tops, and he's 6'6". So he stands out like crazy whether he wants to or not. And so he visits Western Europe, and he wants to learn all he can about European ways, European science, European philosophy, European military tactics, European shipbuilding. He's going to take a turn in Holland working in a shipyard, actually building ships, because he wants Russia to have a great navy. He's a very hands-on kind of guy, which is also true of his hobby. His hobby is amateur dentistry. And there's nothing he enjoys more than pulling teeth out of people's heads. So don't ever complain about a toothache around him, because he'll get right in there. But he is an absolutist. And he's going to use his absolute power to transform Russia into a European nation. So what's he going to do? He's going to reduce the power of the Orthodox Church, which increases his own power. He's going to reduce the power of the boyars, not by killing them, but by simply restructuring their land and giving them new ways. Basically, he's going to issue this thing called the Table of Ranks. And he's going to say, where you are on this table is how much social cred you have. Your status is based on this table of ranks, not on your wealth, not on your lands. It's based on this. And the way to work yourself up the table was to do stuff for Peter. And so he got all the nobility and the elites to try to work their way up this table of ranks to get these privileges that changed the power dynamic. And he modernizes his army. He sends his officers to go train with the best army in the world at the time, the Prussian army, which will eventually become the German army. And then he makes other changes, more social changes, cultural changes. He introduces potatoes. Now, potatoes, hopefully you learned back 7th grade maybe. Potatoes are important historically, right? They come from the New World, but they're important in Europe because they're easy to grow and they have lots of calories. Okay, you avoid mass starvation if you can grow a lot of potatoes. So he introduces those to Russia to reduce hunger. He starts Russia's first newspaper. Okay, newspapers were kind of a new thing in Europe and completely new in Russia. He raises the status of women by about that much. He simply makes them their less official property of their husbands and somewhat independent, but they're still nowhere near equal with men. That won't be until the Russian Revolution, when the Soviet Union becomes the first country in the world to make men and women completely equal. Same education, same jobs, women can be in combat. All this stuff is going to happen when the communists take over. He, like you saw in the picture, adopts Western fashions, including this. As you can see over here, here's Peter. This is a very famous cartoon. And you see how much bigger he is than everybody. And these are his nobles. They're old-timey Russian nobles with the fur coats and the hats and the beards. And Peter cuts their beards off. And you see over here some new-look nobles. Their beards are removed, and they have Western clothes. He's going to force the boyars to look European. And he's not like Ivan or Stalin. He's not going to kill them if they don't. But if you keep your beard, you have to pay a heavy tax on it. So you have to pay the crown a heavy tax to keep your long beard. So most nobles shave it off. He advances education. And by that, I mean education for the elites, for the small Russian middle class, and for the nobles. Russia before Peter is a place where even the nobles are illiterate. Okay, so we're not educating the serfs, the peasants, but his wealthy classes, he's getting more educated, which basically means learning to speak what? French, right? We learned that the other day. So geographically, he wants to make Russia. Now, if you look at the time of Ivan, just this brown bit here was Russia, and they didn't even call it Russia, they called it Muscovy, and the capital was Moscow. And then gradually, the czars over the years just keep expanding, okay? By the time Peter becomes czar, they have taken all of Siberia. And then while he is czar, they will take the Sakhalin Islands right here, this big long Kamchatka Peninsula. Look how far it extends. Look, here's North and South Korea down here. And Russia goes way east of there. Okay, it's equal with Japan. And on the other side, it bumps right up against Europe, so it's giant. And Peter is going to make it bigger. Right. He wants to move the capital out of Moscow. The same way, Louis moved the capital out of Paris and to Versailles to get rid of all the drama and infighting among the nobles there. Peter wants to build an entirely new city. And he's going to build it way west of Moscow. Okay. He's going to build a city that has a seaport that makes it easy to travel and to trade with Europe. And he finds a nice swampy piece of land on the Gulf of Finland that looks perfect after you drain the swamp. And unfortunately, that land is already claimed by Sweden. So Peter goes to war with Sweden, and he wins the port on the Baltic Sea. And then in 1703, they begin from the ground up, okay, from where there was nothing to build this city. And it's, like Disneyland or Disney World or Temecula. Right? There's nothing, and then everything comes in at once. Peter also fancied himself an architect and a builder and an artist, and so he has a daily, highly involved role with building St. Petersburg. And guess what the palaces and things look like? They look like Versailles. He's copying Louis. Right? So he moves and builds a brand new capital city, which will stay the capital until 1922. And of course, it's still Russia. Thousands of serfs are killed in accidents and things building the city. Right? So, Louis employed tens of thousands of people to make Versailles, but tens of thousands of people didn't die for it. But in Russia, draining swamps and things is dangerous work. And so there are many deaths, but we do get St. Petersburg. And this should probably say legacy because it's the end. By the time of Peter's death, Russia is a major European power, okay? From not being at all until being one of the 5 great powers. There's 5 great powers in Europe from now on. There's France, there's Britain, there's Austria, there's Prussia, which will become Germany, and Russia. And so Russia gets into the big boy club thanks to Peter, okay? So there's no guided reading study guide for this, but I want you to go a little more in detail or in depth about Peter because he's really important to Western history. Remember this whole thing about the West. He's the one that brings Russia into our story of the West. And so there's just these little excerpts of his life. And you just read them and answer the questions in the boxes. All right, so you'll read this tiny little bit. And why did Peter travel to Western Europe? Because he had frequent flyer miles, right? Oh, that's not it. But put your answers in the boxes. That's where I'm going to grade. And the way the document's set up, you could type in here, but why? So answer in the boxes, and the box will expand if you have more to say. So that's what you're working on for the rest of class. And if you have basically any undone assignments from the previous unit, okay, so that's up to prologue 3. So you don't worry about the Louis stuff, chapter 5. Don't worry about that. I mean, get caught up with it. But as far as ending for the grading period, you need to get everything done for unit 1, right, that you want credit for. Okay? And